Okay. Tonight, I will try to clarify 9 aspects of musical forming. The fact that I'm able to do this with the terms that I'm going to use is the result of the last 20 years. I can resume and I can point out where the development of the musical thinking, of musical composition, is going to go. In 1951, the word point music has been used for the first time casually by a music critic in Cologne, Mr. Eimet. And what he meant was this. We had heard piano pieces composed by the French composer Olivier Messiaen. And in these pieces, modes de valeur et d'intensité, the composer had reached a synthesis of his research in Indian music, his composition with ragas and talas, then his work with medieval neumes, which he used, for example, in the piece called Ile de Feu, Fire Island, and his research in early Renaissance music, in which the durations as well as the small formulas of pitches were treated with equal importance. The silence having the same importance as a measured duration as the sound, and the research that he had done in the field of the Viennese music of the 20th century, in particular of the music of Anton von Webern, in which the motives and musical themes were reduced ultimately to formulas of 2 notes, so-called intervals. In the piano pieces which I have mentioned, Messiaen tried to give to a row of 12 different notes a different duration to each note and different dynamic value and a different form of an attack. All the possible characteristics of piano sounds were differentiated from note to note. And this was the point of departure for us. When I say us, I mean people like Boulez, Barraquet, Philippot, Vanneau, Yvette Guillemot, Royvarts, the Belgian composer, and myself, having all been students of Messiaen during that time. And the French composers became all familiar with the music of the Viennese composer through René Leibowitz in Paris, who was the only one who owned the scores, and we all copied from each other the works of Schoenberg and Berg, and in particular of Webern, because the scores were not available. This synthesis led to a music which sounded to the music critic as point music. There was even the word star music used during that time because it sounded like points in the sky. the smallest formulas of the music of Weber, I said the two-note formulas, the intervals, were reduced in that music even further. And the first music that the composers which I have just mentioned composed, in particular the Belgian Heuberts, and me being influenced by him, was then an explicit point music, which means we added the idea of the Klangfarben melody, of the melody of the music colors, represented by the different instruments, or vowels, or consonants, to the idea of giving to each note a different duration, a different dynamic, a different pitch, before we would repeat a note, working with series. There could now a lot be said about relationships between our work and the modulo of the Corbusier, who tried to lay the basis for a new method of architecture based on the blue and the red series. The word series reoccurs in that field. Or about a lot of constructive painting that was been done during the early 50s by some constructivists. We could speak about the strong influence on the musicians through certain books during the early 50s, in particular books of Einstein. I don't mean the mathematical books, but the more general books that are generally understandable, or Heisenberg, or biologists like Wieser, Viennese Wieser from the Neumann School, or Norbert Wiener, Man and Machine, etc. There was similar thinking everywhere. The reduction to the smallest possible element of the process of forming. And when I use the word forming, I use it in the sense that the crystallized result of a creative act, the form, being just an instant in a process, and that the whole concentration of the scientists as well as of the artists was more and more focusing on the process. This started already in the early 50s. Famous quote from Victor von Weizsäcker, for example, a German medical specialist and biologist: the things are not in the time, but the time is in the things, occurs in the things. It's very important. The going away from the objective astronomical time, for example, to the biological time, organic concept of time. This became all very important for the musicians who started anew after the last war. And we started, it's too beautiful to be true, with very systematically, with the smallest element, with the single note. And the whole birth of electronic music is not an accident, but it is literally the result of discussions between Heuberts and myself, that we wanted even to synthesize the individual notes, the timbre of the individual sounds, saying the preformed material conditions us too much, which means a clarinet and a piano, and the way how to produce these notes conditions us too much in what we want to do with it. We want to achieve a unified musical structuring, and therefore we want to make our own timbres in order to find a coherent system to derive the micro from the macro concepts and vice versa. After these fairly abstract sentences, I would like to come to musical examples. I have used words like point, group, and mass in order to generalize what is happening in music and to make it clear that what's happening in music is just a particular manifestation of what is happening in general. I play you an excerpt from a composition which is called counterpoints, Kontrapunkte, and the old word counterpoint, as we learned as students, to put a point, counterpoint, against the point. Punctus contra punctum. That's what we learn in school since the 15th century when we make music. And still nowadays, this is the best training for the musical minds, to study counterpoint. It has a complete new meaning, because it literally means for the first time not melody against melody, but point against point. And in the contrapunto, a work which has that title, which I composed in 51, being the second composition after another work for orchestra, which is called Points. For orchestra, Points for orchestra. This is counterpoints for orchestra. After each note there is a silence, and every instrument plays only one note, and then another instrument. Naturally, I could make this clear. If you think of points, a point is not just always a dot, so to speak, in music. It can be a very long note, but it is a note which has all the characteristics on it, its individual characteristics compared to the other notes, as much as possible. And let's say I would make a blue note that were a certain color, like let's say oboe, so that you have a name. And then another one, which would be point being like this. And the third one, start here, up to here. Another one, which would be just that. These are, musically speaking, points, because each element is isolated. There's a silence afterwards, and they have all different pitch, they have all different durations. All the characteristics are as different as possible. If I would still try to indicate the dynamics, as we did, I would have to make them, let's say, just different shapes. And this one would have such a form, diminuendo crescendo, this one a long crescendo. Well, and you see this amplitude, and it's louder than this one. This would be very soft. It wouldn't be very wise to do that because the others would completely cover it. So we must make it. You see immediately already on the paper the danger of the point composition. It's if one wants to be different all the time, a monotony occurs. During the early 50s, people were saying, and still are saying nowadays, Stravinsky has quoted this several times, that this total point music becomes very monotonous, because trying to be different from element to element all the time leads again to something what they all have in common, which means to be different, or try to be different. And it levels out all the organic differences. And then we have blue, which would have such a curve, let's say, another characteristic. No. Okay. differentiate as much as possible in size, which means in volume, as we say nowadays in technical language. That's point music. But already in Kontrapunkte, I'm going to play the beginning of Kontrapunkte, there are naturally a few groups. Because I had composed several pure point compositions before, and I broke my own system, so to speak. More and more small groups occur, which means, for example, that several notes are played by the same instrument. And you will hear after the beginning, which is the pure point music, little groups occurring, and at the end of this example, you will hear even a piano coming out and playing a whole mass of notes, and this brings us then to the terms, to the notions that we are going to discuss later. Please listen now to the beginning of Kontrapunkte. All I can say today about this period is that it was far too short. We should have composed many more and much more thoroughly works of point music. And there is still a lot to be done in the future to be even much more daring than we were. We have passed very quickly then to other aspects of music because the music was reborn completely, technically as well as in its aesthetics since 1951. And I would very much like to see in the future works being composed in which the point structuring spreads out individual notes, individual sound events into space, much larger spaces than we have ever dared to do it at that time. When that work was performed and other works of that same quality, the people were absolutely shocked. They said, what do individual notes mean? And we were naturally somehow influenced by this. And even getting out of our tradition in which I still learned how to compose with themes and motives and melodies, etc. I thought already that the distance between these notes was enormous. For me, a silence of 2 seconds was something that I could barely accept myself. I felt it was too long. I should go on. And nowadays, the silence of 12 seconds for most of the composers is something that they're terribly afraid of. People stop talking or not listening anymore, etc. So, in some of my works now, the longest I have reached is in the 10th piano piece. There are actually silences of the length up to a minute. The radio program, for example, is switched off when this happens. because the engineers are told when the sound is longer than 15 seconds they have to switch off because something is wrong in the machine. You see, we have certain conventions about sound and silence. And these conventions can only very slowly, sometimes more violently, being changed or broken. So I would like to hear point music, and I always will recur to moments in my compositions where all of a sudden individual sounds are spread out in time and space with more and more emptiness between them so that they become more and more clear as individual notes. We got to the second stage of that process that I'm trying to describe, which is at the same time a historical process, as I say, it is a kind of systematical process, which came quite naturally, not because the composers tried to be good teachers, but it just happened that, for example, groups were introduced into the musical composition. By group, I mean that a number of notes which can be counted while we are listening, which means up to 7, 8. A number of notes has at least one characteristic in common. Then the group character is fairly weak. If it's just the color, or let's say it's just the dynamic, that 8 notes are just piano, but they are all different in dynamics, all different in duration, all different in pitch, and all different in tempo, but just they would be all soft. Then they have one characteristic in common, which makes them become a group. Naturally, if all the characteristics are in common, if they are all loud and all high and all played with trumpets or have all a particular kind of tempo and have all the same duration, they are periodic, then naturally the group is the strongest. Then the individual character is lost of the 8 elements. So that's what's happening now in several works. We get more and more groups together with individual notes, with points. And from that moment on, the point doesn't exist anymore, so to speak, in a group composition, because the point is the group with the number 1. If I have 3 notes, 4 notes, 2 notes, 1 note, 5 notes, 6 notes, then the 1 note is the smallest group. It's a question of context. I play you an excerpt from a composition which is called Groups. Well, at that time, I didn't talk like this. That's why I say I can allow myself to speak the way I'm speaking tonight, as if everything would have been pre-planned by some divine force ahead of time. And I would have just followed for 20 years this system. It's not that way, but I can now classify or make the things more simple by using these words. Already in groups with 3 orchestras, you may have heard about this work where 3 orchestras are surrounding the public in a horseshoe form. Each group of players having its own conductor because they play in different time layers, in different tempi, which is superimposed, which is impossible to realize with one man and one orchestra, with one conductor and one orchestra. Also very important aspects that groups have their own time all of a sudden. Individual notes, we say they have their own duration. But groups are beginning to have more and more their own time, their own tempo. Also something that has never occurred in the Western music since there was the common beat introduced into the music in order to control verticality, polyphony. But in the group compositions we come more and more to regions in which groups have their own time, their own metronomical time. And I used chromatic scales of tempi, of speeds. For example, 12 speeds within the ratio 1 to 2, between 60 and 120. I have worked many times with tempi as I worked with pitches. In Gruppen, the notion of group is transcended, as in Kontrapunkte, the notion of points was transcended by introducing groups. And this always happens. That's very interesting. If one concentrates on something, on a certain aspect, then one transcends it because one cannot accept to be in a closed system.